When the letter first arrived, I thought it was a prank. The Homeowners Association demanded $150,000 in fines for violations they claimed I committed on my own property. From leaving construction equipment visible to installing a shed without approval, the list was long, petty, and absurd. I tried reasoning with them, showing proof that my land was outside their jurisdiction, but they doubled down. Threatening liens, legal action, and even barring me from neighborhood facilities, they were relentless. Frustrated, I hired a property attorney to sort it out. That's when the shocking truth came out. A century-old land deed showed that the entire neighborhood, every street, park, and even the HOA clubhouse was technically part of the land I owned. Decades of sloppy paperwork and overlooked records meant the HOA had been enforcing rules on property that was never really theirs. When the HOA's own lawyers reviewed the title history, the case crumbled. They didn't just drop the fines, they had to negotiate with me for the very ground beneath their homes. The irony? The group that tried to punish me ended up realizing I held the ultimate authority. What started as a $1,500K battle turned into a story of misplaced power, legal loopholes, and the strange humor of fate.
The abuse of HOA power is something that many homeowners experience, though not everyone knows how to properly identify it or stand against it. Homeowners associations were originally created to preserve property values, maintain common areas, and ensure that neighborhoods looked and functioned in a way that benefited the community as a whole. In theory, they are supposed to act as caretakers of shared interests. The problem arises when those in positions of authority within an HOA begin to interpret their role less as a duty of service and more as an opportunity for control. Rules that were once meant to encourage cooperation can quickly become tools of intimidation. Instead of focusing on genuine community improvement, an HOA board may target individual homeowners with excessive citations, steep fines, or unnecessary demands, often for issues that do not meaningfully affect anyone else. An example of this can be seen when homeowners are penalized for something as small as the color of a mailbox, the length of grass, or the placement of a garden decoration. These seem minor, but in some communities, such infractions can lead to escalating fines that add up to thousands of dollars. When an HOA uses its power in this way, it creates an environment of fear rather than one of collaboration. Residents may start to feel like they are walking on eggshells in their own neighborhoods, worried that the smallest deviation will lead to punishment. This undermines the very sense of belonging and pride that HOAs were supposed to build. The abuse of power is also amplified by the fact that HOAs often have the ability to place liens on homes and, in extreme cases, even force foreclosures if fines remain unpaid. This is a staggering amount of power for a volunteer-run board of neighbors to hold. Most homeowners assume that only banks or governments have such authority, but HOAs are legally empowered in many states to take these drastic measures. Without proper checks and balances, that power can be weaponized against individuals who may not have the time, money, or legal knowledge to fight back. What makes this situation even more difficult is that many HOA boards are made up of volunteers who may lack training in governance, mediation, or property law. Inexperienced leadership combined with strong personal opinions can easily lead to uneven enforcement of rules. One homeowner might be allowed to bend the rules without consequence, while another is targeted relentlessly. When enforcement becomes inconsistent or biased, it further reveals how abuse of power takes root. Instead of upholding fairness, the HOA becomes a place where favoritism and personal grievances dictate decisions. Another layer to consider is how HOAs often justify their actions under the broad goal of protecting property values. While it is true that keeping a neighborhood tidy can contribute to long-term value, many of the fines and violations issued are far removed from anything that would realistically affect market prices. A shed built on private property, a car parked slightly outside a driveway line, or a house painted a shade darker than approved are unlikely to have a measurable impact on a community's collective worth. Yet, these are often the kinds of battles HOAs fight most aggressively. The disconnect between the stated purpose of protecting value and the reality of nitpicking over trivial matters is a clear sign of power being misapplied. The most important lesson to take from this is that homeowners should be aware of their rights and should not assume the HOA is always correct. Abuse of HOA power thrives in environments where residents are uninformed or too intimidated to question authority. By understanding the governing documents, state laws, and individual property rights, homeowners can begin to recognize when an HOA is acting beyond its scope. Knowledge empowers residents to challenge unfair fines, demand transparency, and hold board members accountable. Ultimately, an HOA should be a framework for cooperation, not a mechanism of control. When its leaders forget that their role is to serve rather than dominate, abuse of power emerges. By studying these patterns and being willing to speak up, homeowners can resist unfair treatment and remind HOAs that their authority is limited, conditional, and meant to exist for the benefit of all, not the bullying of a few.
The importance of property records is something that many homeowners and landowners do not fully appreciate until a dispute arises. Titles, deeds, surveys, and easements may sound like technical paperwork buried in filing cabinets, but they represent the foundation of property ownership and the legal rights attached to it. When these records are unclear, outdated, or mismanaged, entire neighborhoods can be affected, and homeowners may find themselves in unexpected conflicts. In fact, one of the most common reasons for disputes between property owners and organizations like HOAs is a lack of clarity about who actually controls which pieces of land and what restrictions apply. Property deeds, for instance, are legal documents that transfer ownership from one party to another. These deeds often go back decades or even centuries, and each one creates a chain of title that establishes exactly who has owned a particular piece of land throughout history. If even one link in that chain is broken or improperly recorded, confusion can occur. This is why title companies exist. They search through these records during real estate transactions to ensure that buyers are truly receiving ownership free of hidden claims. Without such verification, someone could purchase property only to later discover that another individual or group still has a legal right to part of it. Surveys are another essential record because they show the exact boundaries of a property. A surveyor uses precise measurements to mark where one lot ends and another begins. This is especially important in neighborhoods where homes are close together or where common areas exist. If boundaries are not clearly established, arguments may arise over fences, trees, or even driveways. In cases involving HOAs, the absence of clear surveys can lead to boards assuming they control land that actually belongs to private homeowners. What seems like a minor paperwork detail can evolve into expensive lawsuits if left unresolved. Easements also play a significant role in property records. An easement is a legal right for someone to use another person's land for a specific purpose, such as allowing utility companies to run power lines or providing shared access to a road. These agreements are usually permanent and are tied to the land itself, not the individual owner. Understanding easements is critical because they can limit what a homeowner can do with certain parts of their property. For example, building a structure on top of a utility easement could later force the homeowner to tear it down if the utility company needs access. Without knowledge of these easements, people can unknowingly violate agreements that were recorded decades before they even moved in. One of the most eye-opening aspects of property records is how they reveal hidden or forgotten ownership rights. There are instances where land was never properly transferred, leaving it technically under the ownership of someone long gone. There are cases where overlapping deeds exist because of clerical errors, resulting in two parties believing they own the same parcel.
In such situations, courts rely heavily on the strength of documentation to determine the rightful owner. The party with the most complete, properly recorded history usually prevails. The digital age has made accessing property records easier, but it has also highlighted how many mistakes were made in older handwritten entries and manual filings. A misspelled name, an incorrectly drawn boundary line, or a missing signature might seem insignificant, but those details can decide the outcome of multi-million-dollar disputes. That is why real estate attorneys and title experts emphasize the importance of regular record checks, especially for those who own large amounts of land or properties that border multiple parcels. From an educational perspective, the key takeaway is that property ownership is not just about paying for land and receiving a set of keys. True ownership is backed by a paper trail that proves legal rights beyond question. For homeowners, this means keeping copies of deeds, reviewing surveys, and understanding easements. For communities, it means ensuring that HOAs and local authorities respect the boundaries established in these records rather than overstepping due to assumptions or outdated maps. In the end, property records are much more than bureaucratic red tape. They are the safeguards of ownership, the evidence that prevents abuse of power, and the key to protecting investments that often represent a family's most valuable asset. Without them, ownership becomes a matter of opinion rather than fact, and that opens the door to disputes that can spiral far beyond what anyone expects.
Standing up against unfair authority is one of the most important skills a person can develop, especially when it comes to protecting their home, property, or livelihood. Too often, individuals feel powerless when facing institutions, boards, or organizations that present themselves as having absolute control. Homeowners associations, local governments, and even corporations often rely on the assumption that the average person will not challenge them. This assumption allows them to enforce rules, issue fines, or make demands that may not be lawful or reasonable. The ability to recognize when authority is overstepping its boundaries and to take deliberate, informed action against it is not only empowering, but also necessary for fairness in society. The first step in standing up against unfair authority is awareness. Many people assume that if a group or organization makes a demand, it must automatically be valid. However, authority is always conditional. An HOA, for example, only has power because of governing documents that outline specific rights and responsibilities. If the board issues fines or rules outside of what those documents allow, then their actions have no legal foundation. Similarly, local officials or employers are bound by laws and regulations that restrict what they can and cannot do. The key is learning to question whether an order or penalty is actually supported by written rules or legal statutes. Without awareness, unfair authority goes unchallenged simply because people believe they have no choice. Knowledge is the second element in confronting unfair power. Understanding contracts, bylaws, state laws, and property rights gives an individual the tools to push back effectively. This does not necessarily mean becoming a lawyer, but it does mean knowing where to look for answers. For homeowners, this could be reviewing the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions to see what is truly enforceable. For employees, it could mean learning about workplace protections that prevent unjust treatment. For citizens, it might mean reading local ordinances or constitutional rights. Knowledge transforms frustration into strategy, turning vague feelings of injustice into concrete arguments that can hold up in negotiations or even in court. Persistence is the third factor, because unfair authority often relies on intimidation and exhaustion. Organizations know that legal battles can be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. They may deliberately overwhelm individuals with paperwork, threats, or constant pressure in the hope that the person will simply give up. Standing firm in these situations requires patience and the understanding that persistence can shift the balance of power. History is filled with examples of individuals and small groups who endured long struggles against institutions and eventually forced change because they refused to back down. The same principle applies on the personal level.
A homeowner who refuses to pay an illegitimate fine, demands due process, and insists on transparency often discovers that the authority figure was bluffing or overreaching all along. Another important lesson in standing up against unfair authority is the power of allies. Rarely does anyone succeed entirely alone. Neighbors, community groups, advocacy organizations, and even online forums can provide support, information, and solidarity. When an unfair rule or penalty affects more than one person, collective action becomes a powerful tool. HOAs, for example, are far less likely to succeed in enforcing unfair practices when multiple homeowners band together to challenge them. Collective resistance shows that authority cannot simply single out one person and isolate them. It must face the strength of many voices at once. Finally, standing up against unfair authority teaches responsibility. It is not about resisting every rule or rejecting authority altogether. Rules are necessary for communities to function, but they must be fair, lawful, and applied consistently. Challenging abusive power is a way of reminding organizations that their role is to serve, not to dominate. By speaking up, individuals not only protect themselves, but also set precedents that protect others in the future. Every time someone questions an unfair practice and wins, it sends a message that authority has limits and must remain accountable. In the end, the act of standing up against unfair authority is about balance. Authority exists to provide order, but it must be constantly checked to prevent misuse. When individuals learn to combine awareness, knowledge, persistence, and collective strength, they discover that even the most intimidating organizations can be challenged successfully. What begins as a personal struggle against an unfair fine, penalty, or demand can become a larger lesson in empowerment, proving that authority is never absolute and that ordinary people have more power than they may realize.
The twist of true ownership highlights one of the most fascinating aspects of property law and human relationships with authority. At first glance, it may seem obvious who owns what. But as history, paperwork, and legal boundaries overlap, the reality can be very different. In the case of disputes with HOAs, municipalities, or other organizations, there are times when those attempting to enforce rules discover they do not have the control they believed. Instead, the person they were penalizing or attempting to restrict may turn out to hold the greater legal claim. This reversal reveals how ownership, authority, and perception are often misaligned until examined closely. The idea that someone could unknowingly own far more than they realize may sound like fiction, but it happens more often than people think. Land deeds recorded long ago may have been written in broad terms, sometimes including parcels of land that were never fully separated or transferred. Over decades, new developments may be built on land that still legally belongs to someone else. In such cases, people assume they are subject to the control of local boards or HOAs. But when ownership records are investigated, the true balance of power becomes clear. This is where the concept of true ownership takes on meaning. It is not about appearances, assumptions, or even the day-to-day practices of a community. It is about what the legal documents say, and those documents can redefine the relationship between individuals and organizations. The educational lesson here is that authority often depends on control of property. HOAs, for example, only function because the homeowners within their jurisdiction collectively agree to abide by certain rules and contribute to shared upkeep. But if the very land they govern is discovered to be owned by someone outside their structure, their authority collapses. They cannot enforce rules on land they do not control. This kind of reversal shows how important it is to understand that perceived power is not always the same as real enforceable power. True ownership is the final word, and no fine, threat, or regulation can override it. Another dimension of this concept is that ownership carries responsibility as well as rights.
While discovering that one owns more land than originally thought may feel empowering, it also comes with duties, property taxes, maintenance obligations, and liability for what happens on that land, all shift to the rightful owner. That is why understanding the extent of ownership is essential not only for defending against unfair authority, but also for managing the responsibilities that come with it. Knowledge of ownership is both protection and accountability, ensuring that rights are preserved while duties are acknowledged. True ownership also teaches a lesson in humility for organizations that overstep. When an HOA finds a homeowner only to discover that the homeowner actually owns the land beneath the facilities, it forces a reevaluation of the balance of power. Authority figures may realize that their strength was not inherent but borrowed, based on assumptions that were never verified. For homeowners, this reinforces the importance of not simply accepting penalties or threats without questioning them. The authority figure may believe they are in control, but the deeper truth may reveal otherwise. This twist serves as a reminder that fairness and justice are often hidden in the details. It is easy for institutions to act as though they are unchallengeable, but careful investigation can flip the script entirely. This reversal is not about revenge or humiliation, but about restoring balance. When the rightful owner is recognized, rules must be rewritten, negotiations must be made, and respect must be given where it is due. The very act of uncovering true ownership reshapes relationships and forces those in power to operate within the limits of reality rather than assumption. Ultimately, the twist of true ownership is about the strength that comes from facts and records. In a world where appearances can be deceiving and authority is often projected through confidence or intimidation, ownership remains an unshakable foundation. The one who holds the deed, the survey, and the title has the final say. For homeowners, this means that what might appear to be a hopeless battle against overwhelming authority can suddenly turn in their favor when the facts of ownership are revealed. It underscores the principle that knowledge and documentation are stronger than threats, and that the truth, once uncovered, can shift power in unexpected and decisive ways.